This is a made label sew along for the Belle wrap skirt. You can purchase the pattern at the link on the screen, and if you need any help assembling it, check out our studio/assemble link. The Belle skirt is part of our mix and match wrap collection. That means that you can choose any top out of the wrap collection to create a beautiful dress, or if you've already sewn up a dress, you can use the Belle skirt to create new combinations. To see all the patterns available in the wrap collection, you can check out the link on the screen, which will also be listed below. To make this skirt, you want a woven non-stretch material, and if you want a light and airy kind of skirt, you want to opt for something with a good drape such as a rayon or viscose. A heavier fabric like a linen will work, your skirt will just have a more straight silhouette. Always pre-wash and iron your fabric before you start cutting, and then you can avoid any kind of shrinkage that is going to happen. To choose your size, you want to focus on the waist measurement in the finished measurement chart. As it is a wrap skirt, you'll find around the hips that there is a little more give in terms of size. And if you are making this skirt after making a dress with the same pattern pieces, make sure that you do go and check the finished measurement chart to make sure that you still want to make that same size that you made the dress in. Of course, we always recommend a sample or toil to get the perfect fit, and if you are going to make that out of an old duvet or scrap fabric, you can just cut it to mini length just to test the fit. We give back with every pattern, and you can check that out at madelabel.co/giving back. At the start of your sized pattern files, you will find cutting plans for midi, mini and maxi length that will tell you how much fabric you need for your desired length of skirt. As the pattern does use the same pattern piece for the dress and the skirt, you want to cut along the yellow line when you are making the Belle skirt. That a little bit of extra space at the top is for when you're using this pattern piece with a dress combination. And you can use the reference page numbers to only print the pages that you need for the length that you want to make to help save the trees. Using scaled down patterns, we're going to show you how to cut the different type of pattern pieces. So starting with mirror cut pattern pieces, this is when you're going to cut mirror versions of the same pattern piece. So you can either cut these one at a time or folding your fabric in half, making sure that your grain line is in line with the selvage edge. You can cut both pairs at one time by cutting the entire way around the pattern piece. Remember to also cut out your two little notches, which are not included here because the pattern is so small. Now, if you are a beginner and starting out, you may find that it's easier to cut these separately and not on a folded piece of fabric, as you will get a little more movement when your fabric is folded in half. And once you've finished cutting and you open it out, you'll see that you have mirror versions of that same pattern piece, creating two sides of your skirt. With place on fold pattern pieces, you want to make sure that that folded edge is an equal distance away from your selvage edge to make sure that your middle line is going to be very straight. So you want to line that place on fold mark up with the folded edge of your fabric and weigh it down. Then you are going to cut all the way around the outside of the pattern piece, but not on the fold line. And when you open it up, you'll have symmetrical sides to the same pattern piece. Just a note, it's also a really good idea to put the little labels on the waistband and the tie, as the pieces look very similar. So the next thing you're going to do is choose whether you want to make a skirt with 4 or 5 buttons. Of course, you could make it with no buttons at all if you so choose. For your iron-on facing, you want to cut to the 4 line if you're doing 4, or the whole rectangle if you're doing 5. So you want a friction pen and an awl or some type of hole punching tool. The first thing you want to do is punch holes in all the places that you are going to need to mark where the buttonholes start and end. You then want to line it up, making sure your grain line is in line with your selvage edge, and you're going to cut the entire way around your button backing. It is very important that you cut this with your fabric facing right side up. And the little notch at the top will tell you where to line it up with the top of your skirt. So with an iron-off pen of some description, we love the friction pen, you are then going to mark all of those points that you stabbed. You want to make sure that you can really see it on the fabric before you fully move the pattern piece. Then you're going to come and join those marks up the same way that they are drawn on the original pattern piece. These buttons are set up for 2cm buttons, so do make sure that your buttons are going to fit in these holes nicely. And because we are going to be using an iron to turn these edges in, which will make the ink disappear, you do want to use a little tailor's tack at the top and the bottom of these marks, so that when the iron-off pen irons off, you still know where to redraw your lines. So just a couple of stitches and then a knot in the back to hold it in place. And you want to tag at the start and end of all those buttonholes. Next, you want to add stay stitching down the side of the skirt that's going to hang. So you're just going to add one line of stitching on the seam that is not going to attach to the back of the skirt. So you want to do this around 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter away from the edge of the fabric. Adding this straight line of stitch is going to stop anything from warping during your project, so that your skirt hangs straight down, and you want to keep it as close to the edge as you can. And once you've finished, you just want to press those stitches in place. So you can see on the right side and bottom side of the pattern that we want to fold the edge in 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter. So you want to fold in 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter along the side edge and also along the bottom edge, giving it a really good press in the corner. Once you have pressed it, you want to unfold those two edges and mark at the points that they are crossing over at the corner where they make a little X. You then want to use that crossover point and mark a diagonal line, creating a little triangle on the corner of the fabric. Once you have that drawn, you want to fold your fabric in half, making sure that line meets on either side of your fabric, and sew a straight line of stitching across that line. Once you've sewn it, you want to tie off your loose ends to make sure that the stitching isn't going to go anywhere. You then want to flip the fabric to create a nice pointed corner. Once you're happy and you know that it's created the corner that you want, you can go back and snip off that excess triangle that was there and press everything flat. And you're going to have a nice pointed edge of your button backing. Next, we're going to add the iron-on interfacing. So you're going to have a bumpy side with glue dots and a smooth side. So what you want to do is trim away any of those extra threads from your tacking. And then you want to put the bumpy side of your facing down onto the wrong side of your fabric, and you want to just fit it into that little side seam that you've just pressed. It should fit in there really beautifully, and the main thing is that you want it to cover where the first buttonhole starts. Next, you want to lay a damp piece of cotton, and you can use an offcut on top of your facing, and you want to make sure there is no wrinkles. And then you are going to press and steam. You don't want to iron, but hold it over each section for 3 to 4 seconds and really give it a good steam. And once you're finished, you'll find that your facing is all glued on to your fabric and there shouldn't be any bumps or wrinkles. And at this point, you can redraw your lines from the tacks that you have put in place. And now you have a button backing that is stabilized and ready to go. Next, we're going to sew the button backing onto the front panel of the skirt. With the wrong side facing up, you want to sew it onto the side left panel, and we're going to be sewing it onto the seam that's going to hang straight down on the front of your skirt. The button backing wants to go wrong side down on the skirt, and the raw edge that has no folded over seam is going to line up with the edge of the skirt. We're going to double roll the side of this hem so that the button backing just sits into there nicely. So first, folding in 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter, you want to press the whole way down that stay stitched edge. You then want to come back and roll in another 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter and press it again. So you can see along that whole edge where you had stay stitching, you'll now have a lovely double rolled hem. So you want to neaten up that raw edge of your button backing, just making sure it's nice and straight. And taking that newly cut edge, you want to slide it under that double rolled hem, making sure it's fit in there nice and snug. You want to make sure it's pressed firmly against that crease and that your notch is at the top of your skirt. Then you just want to pin it in place the entire way around the edge of the button backing. We're then going to sew as close to the edge as you feel possible, including on top of that double rolled hem, and you don't need to sew along the very top. So you just want to take this nice and slow at the machine, and you want to get as close to the edge as possible, but you do have around 1 centimeter, of course, that's folded in. At the corners, you can just pivot and then continue on sewing. And you should have a beautiful line of stitching around your button backing. The reason that we start sewing the buttonholes on before you sew the whole skirt is so that if you do ever make a mistake, you only need to recut one panel of the skirt. But still, it's a great idea to do a practice button, especially if you're new to buttons. You want to make sure that it looks exactly the same as your button that you're going to be sewing on. So you want to make sure that you have interfacing sandwich between 2 layers of fabric for your practice buttonholes as well. You also want to draw out where you want to sew your buttonholes so you can get it exactly right. So if you've never worked with a button foot before, you want to put your button into this little back section that moves, and then you're going to squish it in, which is going to tell your machine how long to make your buttonhole. So if you've never sewn a buttonhole on your machine before, we suggest Googling the name of your sewing machine and then how to sew buttonholes to get a more in-depth tutorial for your particular machine. We're going to be doing it on our Singer that has a 1-step buttonhole today. So the first thing you want to do is put on your buttonhole foot, and you want to pull down your lever so that it goes in between these 2 little places. And that is going to tell the machine when to get to the end of the buttonhole and start sewing back up. So sliding your test button backing in, there's 2 areas you want to line up. So you want to figure out with your machine where the buttonhole starts. With this machine, it's in this hole and red line. So lining the start of the buttonhole up, this machine sews backwards. It does, however, sew about 2 or 3 stitches forward first. So this is why you need to get familiar with your machine and do a test so you know your little quirks of how it sews the buttonholes. The next thing you want to make sure of is that your buttonhole is going to sew straight. So on your button foot, you should have some type of guider that you can line up with the middle of your button backing or whatever you're going to sew. A little tip is to always start with an internal buttonhole first, as the ones on the very edge are always just a little bit trickier to line up and sew. So lining those 2 areas up, you want to put your foot down, and with the 1 hole button selected, just let the machine do its thing. Now, another little tip is if a buttonhole is going to malfunction, it's usually in the first little part. Once it's halfway through, generally it's going to be smooth. So if you watch that first little bit very carefully and you notice that something is happening that doesn't seem right, you can just unpick that little area without any problems at all. The key here is just to keep practicing until you feel confident to move on to your skirt panel. Also, if you are starting a little bit before or after the marks, don't worry too much. Once your button's in there, not even you are going to notice this. So starting at the second buttonhole in with our little tip, it's time to go ahead and sew those buttonholes. Remember to always line up where the buttonhole starts and make sure that you've got a guide so that the buttonholes are sewing straight. Just keep your eye on those first couple of stitches, and if you notice anything strange, just stop and unpick. Now once you've sewn your first 3 buttonholes, a little tip is to turn the skirt around and sew the top buttonhole backwards. This just allows the machine to grab onto more material and it doesn't run off the edge of the skirt, which is going to make that top buttonhole a lot easier to sew. And congratulations, you've sewn your buttonholes and you can clip away any stray threads. Now I want to show you mistakes happen. We actually sewed this second buttonhole down in the wrong place and unpicked the whole entire finished buttonhole. So our little tip is to use tiny scissors instead of a seam ripper. It allows you to cut the threads instead of pulling them, which will have less damage on your fabric, but you can see that you can hardly even notice that there was a different buttonhole there. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. So with the scary part of the skirt over, we're going to be diving into assembling this skirt with French seams. You're going to be joining the back skirt panel to the 2 front skirt panels. So starting with your material wrong sides together, you want to line up the little notch marks and pin in place. And you want to pin both sides of the skirt together, and then you're going to sew a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam. Line the fabric up with the 3/8 of an inch mark on your foot and then just sew a straight seam down both sides of your skirt. Once you have that seam sewn, you want to press the stitches in place. Then you want to trim back the material to less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter. You then want to open your skirt out and you want to press this seam flat. Once you've pressed both sides of the skirt, you want to flip it so the wrong sides are facing out. Then you want to wiggle that sewn seam to the outside edge and you want to press it flat with the iron, making sure that you're using a good bit of steam. And once you've pressed both sides of the skirt, we're going to finish the French seam off with 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter seam down both sides. So at the machine, line up your presser foot with the 1/4 of an inch mark on your sewing panel and sew down both ends. You then want to press that line of stitching in place and then open up your skirt and press the beautifully encased edges of the French seam to one side. For a skirt, we suggest pressing this forward. Finally, you want to flip your skirt over and slightly pulling the seam apart with your fingers, just go and give it one more press. So next we're going to be sewing the mitered corners on the corner edges of the skirt. So you want to start by folding in 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter along both the sides that lead to the corners. At the corner point, just overlap the folds. The bottom edge of the skirt may be a little bit trickier to fold over and press because it is a curved seam. You can dampen it down and give it a little pull if you're having trouble. You then want to come back and fold in another 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter seam, using the same technique as you did the first time around. Remember that on one of the sides of your skirt, you are already going to have folded in and pressed your double rolled hem, so make sure that you're only pressing in the bottom on that side. Then unroll the last fold so that you just have one fold leading up to the corner. You then want to measure that one fold, and whatever that measurement is, you want to double it. Once you have your measurement starting from the point, you want to mark each side of the corner. You then want to take the straight edge of your ruler and join up those two marks that you have made. This will create a triangle on the corner of your skirt. You then want to fold the corner with right sides together and make sure that that mark is matching on both sides and pin it in place. You're then going to go to the machine and sew straight along that line that you have made. Again, just make sure that the line is meeting on both sides. It can be a good idea when you're sewing to sew one way and then backstitch the whole way across, just to make sure it is nice and secure. Once you've sewn along the line, you can tie off the ends as we did on the other one, and then you want to flip it inside out and make sure that it is creating a nice corner. Once you can see that everything is in place, you can flip it again the wrong way out and trim off that little extra bit of fabric. Finally, flip it the right way in again and give the corner a good press. And you want to do that on both of the mitered corner edges. From here, you just want to go back and finish the rest of your rolled hem. First, folding 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter and pressing, and then coming back to roll the second pass. And once that's finished, we're going to sew along the edge of the rolled seam. You want to start on the side of the skirt that does not have the button backing on it, and then you're going to sew very slowly all the way around. When you reach the curves, make sure your needle is down so you can pivot the material and then continue sewing. Use your hand wheel at the corners if you need to, just for those first few stitches. Continue sewing all the way around until you reach the point where the button backing starts. And once you reach the stitches that you did around the button backing, you just want to give a little back stitch just to make sure that it holds firmly in place. And you can see that that is going to give you a continuous line of stitching between your rolled seam and where the button backing starts. You then want to give the hem a really good press, especially down the straight edges of the skirt. Lastly, it's a good idea just to give your hem a little inspect and make sure that there's no places that you've missed. And at this point of your project, you're going to have your skirt really coming together with the two sections all sewn up and your buttonholes all completed. So it's time for the waistband. So starting with the tie that's going to sit on the outside of the waistband, you want to fold it in half with right sides together and then press it the whole way along the tie. We're then going to sew a 3/8 inch or a 1 centimeter seam along the tie, leaving one end open. And starting at that open end, you're going to sew all the way down the edge of the tie. When you reach the corner, you want to pivot the foot and then sew right off the edge. Coming back to press the stitches in place and then trim back a little bit of that excess material, cutting diagonally across where the corner is. To turn the tie inside out, you want to grab anything long and skinny such as a chopstick, first turning that little first point in and then pulling the fabric down as you go. Once your tie is the right way around, you just want to wiggle that sewn seam to the outside edge, coming along and pressing with the iron as you go. Your tie is now complete and you should have one open end and one closed end. Next, it's time to tackle the waistband. It does have a few sections to it, so we're going to show you what you're working towards. You can see the waistband ties where the button detail is, and the tie that you just sewed up is going to be the one that is joined to the waistband and ties to the end of the skirt. One of the waistband sides is going to be longer, as it also includes a tie and the inside has a little buttonhole. With right sides facing up, you want the waistband back in the middle. On the left side, you want the waistband side, which is the shorter side. And on the right side, you want the waistband side with the tie, which is going to be the longer side. Then you've got your little tie that you have sewn up, and that is going to sit from the halfway point at the join between the waistband side and the waistband back. So first we're going to join the waistband back to the waistband side with the tie. So with right sides together, you just want to pin them in place, making sure that the edges are lined up nice and evenly. Next, we're going to move on to joining the other side of the waistband, which is the shorter edge. This is going to be the place where you insert the tie into the waistband. It's important that with right side facing up that you're adding the tie into the bottom half of the waistband. The reason for this is once you fold the tie over and you add it to the skirt, you want to make sure that that tie is on the outside edge of the waistband. So adding it to the bottom will assure that this happens. So again, flipping them over so they are right sides together, pin it in place so that nothing moves around. You then want to measure the halfway point on the waistband, and you want to put a pin through that point so that when you open the waistband up, it's only going to open to halfway. Making sure the sewn seam of your tie is pointing down, you want to press the folded edge of the tie up towards that pin, making sure again that the raw edge of your tie is pointing out of the end of the waistband. You then want to fold the waistband back down, sandwiching your tie in there and pinning it securely in place. Once it's securely pinned, you also want to mark where the tie ends, and from that point to the bottom of the waistband, you need to have 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter of space that you're going to turn up later. You then want to sew 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeter seams across both of the waistband joins. And once you open up your waistband, you'll see that your tie is beautifully sandwiched into your waistband. And the other side of your waistband should just have a nice seam. Next, we're going to sew a line of basting 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the top of the skirt. You want to sew this in sections, so you want to sew one line of stitching for the back and one line of stitching for each of the side panels. So setting your stitch length to basting or 4, which is a long stitch length, you want to sew a line of basting stitch 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the top of your skirt, stopping at each side seam. The reason that we use this basting stitch is to use it as a guide as to where we're going to sew the waistband. But stopping at each side seam also allows you to use this as a gather on the back skirt panel should you need to bring it in a little bit to make the back panel of the waistband fit perfectly. So now that we have our guiding line of stitches, we're going to add the waistband. So first we're going to get the waistband ready to sew on. The first step is pressing the joins open. We're then going to fold the waistband in half with wrong sides together. You want to make a real effort here to make sure that it is even the entire way down as you press. You should see that your tie is sitting at the halfway point of that folded edge, and if a little bit is over the top folded edge, don't worry about that, it's absolutely fine. As the tie is going to sit on the outside of the skirt, that is going to tell you which side of your waistband is the front. And on this front side of your waistband, we want to turn up the edge 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Because one side of your waistband also has the tie attached, we only want to fold up to the place where the waistband ends and the tie begins. So lining up the side seam where the back panel and the waistband with the tie meet, you want to mark 1 inch or around 2.5 centimeters past the point where the skirt ends, and this is where your tie will begin. For ease of reference, in the video, we've used little notches to show you where this would be, but you should mark with a pin or tailor's tack, something that isn't going to iron off. So once you know where your waistband is going to end, you want to continue to press the front side of the waistband 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter up the entire way along. When you reach the mark that tells you you're at the end of the waistband and where the tie begins, you can stop folding over and pressing. From here, you want to fold the waistband back in half along that initial halfway fold point on the waistband. Again, you only need to fold up to the point where the waistband ends on that marked point. You then want to fold that extra little bit up, which is the back of the waistband, over the top of the front of the waistband. This is going to give you a little bit of overhang on the back side of the waistband, which is important when we're going to be sewing it onto the skirt. Press this up the entire length of the waistband again until you reach your notch marked, telling you where the tie begins. And you can see once you unfold it, so the waistband is just folded in half again, there's going to be a little bit of extra overhang on the back side. Now, an extra step we like to take just to make sure everything is even the entire way along the waistband is to pin it in place so the overhang is about 2 millimeters the whole way down the waistband, and then come back and press it in place, which is going to give you a really nice foundation for the waistband when you're sewing it onto the skirt. At your changeover point where your waistband turns into the tie, you just want to have it folded in half and you can give it a nice press. So starting where your tie is on your waistband and making sure that's on the outside of the skirt, open up the waistband and pin the front side of the waistband right sides together along the basting stitching line you did on the skirt, taking special care to make sure that the waistband seam and the skirt seam are lining up. You want to continue to pin the entire way along the skirt. The reason that we pin along this basting line and not at the top of the skirt is so that there's a little bit extra fabric on the waistband that gives it enough reinforcement to make it a little bit thicker, but it isn't as thick as an iron-on facing would be, so it has a little more movement and isn't as stiff. And once you get to the end of pinning the waistband, don't worry about that little overhang, and we will deal with that when we sew it on later. It's always good to check at this point too that your tie is still on the outside of the waistband. Once you've pinned the front panel, we're going to move on to the back panel. So you want to mark the halfway point on the back skirt panel, and you can do this by folding it in half and marking it with a pin. And you want to use the same technique, marking halfway on just the back section of the waistband, folding it in half at the two seams and marking it with a pin. Once you have those 2 points marked, you want to mark up the halfway point on the waistband with the halfway point on the skirt and pin that first section. Sometimes you may find that the top of your skirt may have pulled a little bit as it is not cut on any grain line. If that is the case, you can always use that basting stitch that you're using to guide where you're pinning the skirt to just gather it in a little bit. But if you're finding everything's fitting well, just make sure you line up your side seams and use that basting stitch line to line up the raw edge of the waistband. And you're going to continue using the same technique on the final section of the skirt, lining up the raw edge of the waistband with that stitched basting line. When you do reach the buttonhole, make sure that that folded edge of the waistband, which is where we're going to sew across, you want to make sure it's about 2 millimeters above the buttonhole. And if you have to go a little bit above that basting stitch, that is totally fine. If you pin along that folded edge and then flip the waistband up, you'll be able to see exactly where it's going to sit and make sure that it is just above that buttonhole. Then you can go back and pin everything in place. We're then going to head to the sewing machine and using that folded edge as a guide, sew a straight stitch all the way across the top of the waistband. Starting from the side with the buttonholes, you want to just put your waistband under your presser foot, making sure that you're sewing along that folded line as a guide the whole way along the waistband. Once you finish sewing, your waistband will be attached and it should leave around 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch of skirt above the raw edge. You also want to check that it has gone just above the buttonhole. We're then going to press everything in place, slightly pulling up the waistband as you go along and press with the iron. Also make sure that your side seams are all matching perfectly. Next, we're going to come back and sew the tie that joins onto the waistband. So you want to start by ironing the tie area out flat. We're then going to be folding it right sides together in half and pressing it right up to the point it joins to the waistband. You then want to pin it in place, starting at the point closest to the skirt all the way to the edge of the tie. You're then going to sew a seam 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter away from the edge of the tie. But first we're going to head to the other side of the skirt. So this side we want to have a nice clean edge where we're going to add the buttonhole. So folding it in half, you want to press in place. Then you want to pin just to hold everything. Make sure that the top edges are lined up evenly. Once you have everything where you think it should be, add another crosswise pin. And you're going to be following the line of the skirt and sewing straight across the top of the waistband. So starting at the folded edge, you want to make sure that you have the middle of your presser in line with the edge of your skirt and sew one straight line all the way down. Make sure you do give a few little back stitches to make sure everything is secure. Moving on to the tie end of the waistband, you want to start closest to the skirt, making sure that you give a few little back stitches at the start to make sure it's going to be secure. And then you're going to sew 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter away from the edge down the entire length of the tie, pivoting at the end and sewing right off the edge, again finishing with a back stitch. So you should have a line of stitching that is following the edge of the skirt but isn't attached at the very top, and you just want to flip that over, leaving all the little bits for now, and you can see that it's going to give you a nice finished edge that should follow right along the edge of the skirt. Once you're happy with where everything is sitting, you can just clip off the extra bits of fabric. And flipping it the right way in again, you're going to have a beautiful finished end of your waistband. Moving on to the tie, you're going to have your back stitched area and then a line of stitching, and we're just going to trim down the extra fabric along that line of stitching. Once you reach the back stitching, make sure that you leave about 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch of clear space. Next, grabbing your long skinny tool such as a chopstick, start pushing the tie the right way in, first feeding through a little bit at the end and then using that to just feed through the rest of the tie. We find it helpful just to scrunch the material up there and then push it back through. Once you have it the right way in, then you want to roll the seam to the outside edge and press flat with your iron. You should find at the point where the tie and the waistband joins that everything just folds over pretty intuitively. Next, we're going to pin the back of the waistband ready to securely sew. So because we made the back of the waistband just a little bit longer than the front, you're going to find that you're going to be able to cover that front line of stitching with the folded edge of the waistband. So you're going to be pulling it over and covering both the basting line of stitch and the line of stitching that you did on the front of the waistband. Then you're going to come along and pin that in place the entire way along the skirt. At the side seams, you might find it helpful just to snip a little bit of the extra bulk away from there so that it folds over nicely. Continuing to pin the entire way around the skirt, just making sure at your side seams that everything is matching up nicely. And once you reach your buttonhole, you want to make sure that the back folded edge is covering that line of stitching but is just kissing the top of that buttonhole. And at the tie, you're going to have just a little section where there's no stitching. So you want to pin at the very start of that section, and that is going to be where we start our stitching. To do this final line of stitching, we're going to be using a technique called stitch in the ditch. You're going to be stitching in that little space between the skirt and the waistband. Because we made the back waistband just a little bit longer than the front, it's going to catch it and secure it in place. Starting at the point that you pinned on the tie, you're just going to sew that first little bit. Then you're going to transition to stitching in that ditch. Take this very, very slowly. You're probably going to want to get right up close to the presser foot and just go a couple of stitches at a time until you reach the end. It does take a little bit of getting used to, but produces a very professional and beautifully finished waistband on the front. And on the back, you can see that it is just caught the entire way down. I'm going to do a quick spot check to make sure you haven't missed any places. And of course, we're going to finish with a good steam and press. So you're going to have your button closure on one side, and on the inside, we're going to put a button and a buttonhole. So right on the very edge of your waistband is where we're going to place the buttonhole. So we want the button to sit in the middle of the waistband. So you want to mark the halfway point on your waistband and then draw a long line down the middle that you're going to line up your button foot with. Then you want to place your button around 2 millimeters away from the edge and mark the start of the buttonhole. keeping in mind the 2 points that we need to line up with the button foot, one being the middle line to keep it straight and the start of the buttonhole, remembering that this particular machine does so backwards. Popping the button into the foot, you're going to line up the fabric so that you have the middle point and start point both lined up. And then you're going to let the machine do its thing. Now, as this is a different size buttonhole, you may want to do another test just before you jump straight into sewing it on the waistband. With all our buttonholes complete, we're going to cut them open. So you can use a tool like this, which is a button cutter, or you can just simply use some tiny scissors. So taking your fabric and folding it in half along the button edge, you just want to snip a tiny little opening enough to get the point of your scissors in. And then you're going to cut up just before the edge of the stitching, and you don't want to snip that stitching, so just be careful here. Once you've cut open the buttonhole, you just want to do a test and make sure that everything is working. And you're just going to do the same on all 4 of the big buttonholes. And there you've got it, buttonholes, not so scary. Now, one of the great things about sewing is that you sew to fit your body, and so now is the time to try on the skirt and mark where you want the button to sit that's going to hold the first waistband closure, and also where you want your 4 or 5 button front detail to be. Make sure that you have it at the point of your waist where you intend to wear it, as it will change where your buttons will be. So we're going to get our 4 or 5 2cm diameter buttons and our 1 2-hole 1cm button. Now the next step is definitely optional, and on these lightweight fabrics you may find that the buttons eventually create a hole in the fabric. We want our garments to last the test of time, so we're just going to add these little button backings which will create stability behind the button. So getting your 4 or 5 button backings, you want to fold them right sides together and then sew a 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter seam down both sides. Once you have them all sewn, you're going to use your chopstick again to flip them the right way in and just point the edges out, and then roll the seams to the outside edge and press flat. So testing where your button sits on them, you're going to cut off just a little bit of extra fabric, and then you are going to turn that raw edge up so that all 4 sides of your little button backings have a nice finished edge. And then you're going to press them in place. Next, we need to know where to place them on the back side of the skirt. So what we're going to do is put a pin in the very top and the very bottom of the mark. So once you flip the skirt over, you'll see the first point where the pin enters the fabric is the top of the mark, and the last point where you see the pin on the fabric is the bottom of the mark. Pin them in place with a pin at the very top and the very bottom, making sure that you're covering the top of the pin and the bottom of the pin that you can see on the back side of the fabric. And when you flip it over, you'll be able to see where your backing starts and ends. Now we're going to sew all the way around the edge of each of the button backings, but before you do that, just make sure you pull out that first guiding pin that you put in there, as we don't want any extra pins while we're at the machine. It's easiest to start on the side away from the ball head of the pin, and then you don't have to remove the pins until you reach the second last edge. This can take a little bit of maneuvering going right around the edge of the button backing, but in the end it's going to create a very stable button. So on the back you can see all 4 of the button backings, and on the front you've just got a little square of stitching which will basically be covered by the buttons, so you'll hardly see them at all. So next we're going to sew on our button. So you want to thread your hand needle, making sure you don't make the thread too long, and finishing the end with a triple knot. Next, you want something to slide underneath the button when you're sewing it on. We use a bobby pin and just press the end flat so you can pull it out at the end. So taking your button, you want to line it up with the mark. Starting your first stitch from the back of the skirt, take your time finding that the hole is in line with where you place the first needle point. Once you pull it out, you're going to make sure that your button is straight and the way that you want it to sit, and then you're going to thread it through your other buttonhole. Again, making sure that you're threading straight. Once you put it back up, make sure that you're as close to the first hole as possible. So once you've done those first few stitches, you're then going to insert your bobby pin or matchstick or whatever you have around in between the skirt and the button. Continue to sew through the holes, and you want to go about 5 or 6 rounds. Having the bobby pin between the skirt and the button helps lift it off the skirt so it's not pressed firmly on there, and is also going to create a more stable button when we wrap the thread around at the end. Another thing to keep in mind when you're sewing the button is to make sure that you're, as much as possible, reusing those initial stitch holes. So once you've sewn about 5 or 6 rounds and your button is feeling firm, put the needle through the button so it doesn't catch any of the back fabric, and then you want to wind the fabric around between the top of the bobby pin and the bottom of the button, making sure that you're not catching anything if you're using a bobby pin or matchstick. You want to do around 4 or 5 circles, and then thread the needle back to the back of the skirt and finish with a couple of knots. Then you can snip the extra thread and your button is now complete. It's going to look very neat on the back, and once you pull that bobby pin out, you're going to find your button is extremely stable and is going to last the test of time. And you just want to complete that with all your other buttons. Then we're going to move on to the little waistband button. So we're going to use a little sewing hack so that we're just sewing the button onto the inside of the waistband and you won't be able to see it on the outside. So what you want to do is pinch the front of the waistband and then hold it with anything you have hanging around. A bulldog clip or a hair clip will do perfectly. You then want to choose a small needle, which will make it a lot easier to maneuver while you're sewing on the button. So you want to start with your thread tied with 2 knots at the end, and then you're just going to catch the first little bit of material. Then you're going to thread your button onto the needle and go back and again catch some more of the back of the waistband. Threading it up through the buttonhole again, you're then going to pull the button on tight to the waistband. From here, you're just going to tilt the button forward, and instead of sewing right through the waistband, you're just going to catch a little bit of the back of the waistband. Each time you can secure with a little knot just to make sure it's extra stable. I like to go around about 5 or 6 times at least, just to make sure that everything is going to stay in place really securely. And once you have finished that, you want to finish off the button in the same way by looping the material around between the button and the skirt and tying off with a couple of knots. Clipping off your loose threads, you should find that your button is now securely sewn on to the back of your waistband, but the front of your waistband you won't be able to see any marks. And that completes your belle wrap skirt with your button front detail.